We came here to tell you how Armenian women in the past spoke feminist. We are in the process of writing a book and developing a digital archive devoted to the history of Western Armenian feminist thought and activism from mid-19th to mid-20th centuries. Titled Feminism in Armenian, our project uncovers the lives and works of 12 prominent Armenian women intellectuals who were, except for one, were all born in Ottoman capital in Constantinople and died in various places, including the Republican Istanbul, Paris, New York, and Beirut.
Although they were all prolific writers and tireless activists, they remain absent in our scholarly analysis, in our textbooks, history textbooks, literature textbooks, in our collective memory and public discourse. We first recognized this invisibility when we were both college students in Istanbul in the late 1990s, and we were both immersed quite intensively in the feminist circles on campus. Pretty soon, we learned about the history of Ottoman women's movement. We were at Boğaziçi University, this is a Turkish university, but soon we kind of decided, I got curious about the history of those Ottoman women who were non-Turkish. How about Armenians? Did Armenians have a similar kind of women's movement in the 1890s, for instance, when the Ottoman Turkish women's movement was emerging? We both went to Armenian educational institutions for 11 years, but except for a couple, we had never heard even the names of prominent Armenian women intellectuals.
And after this, we committed ourselves to finding our feminist ancestors. In this journey that we began 20 years ago, we have been conducting research, writing books and articles, giving lectures, and sharing our enthusiasm to find out feminist Armenian past with activist circles and our academic colleagues. In 2006, we wrote a book in Turkish about 5 prominent Armenian women intellectuals in the Ottoman Empire and in the Republic of Turkey. With this book, we showed that it is impossible to study Ottoman women's movement by excluding the voices and experiences of Armenian and other non-Turkish women. And by documenting the very existence of these women in the history of the community that we grew up in, the Armenian community in Istanbul, we facilitated the incorporation of their writings in school curricula. Bir Adalet Feryadı is now used in Turkey as a textbook, both in Armenian high schools and at universities, Turkish universities.
And today we are both college students teaching courses on the history of women and gender in the Middle East and North Africa. But unfortunately, what we can assign from the history of Armenian women or books or other kind of writings produced by Armenian women is very limited. One of the goals of our current project is to end this scarcity in English language. So Feminism in Armenian is a 2-pillar project. One of the first leg is the book, which is an interpretive anthology, in which you'll be able to find the biographies of these 12 women that we are focusing, as well as a selection of their writings in English translation. And it has a website component. It's not just a website, it's a digital archive, first in its own right, in which we provide everything in its original Armenian, primary sources. It is a work in progress right now. Educators, teachers, whoever is interested it will be open access, and you can navigate it both in Armenian and in English. In terms of content, for instance, each women's section will have, we have already digitized everything that these women have ever wrote. So their books will be there in digital format, as well as archival material. We have conducted research in various places around the world, and their letters, their unpublished correspondence of various sources, memorabilia, their pictures, photos of different sorts will also be archived there digitally. So not just the content of our book, but also our methodology is informed by our commitment to do scholarship as feminists and do feminist scholarship. So the project already built a community of some sorts around itself. We are working with 4 Armenian women scholars as our translators for the book. It is a collective project.
Who were these 12 women that our project focuses on? Yelbiske Saratsyan was the editor of the first Armenian women's journal. And this journal, titled Guitar, was the second ever published women's journal in the entire Ottoman Empire. The second woman that we focus on is Sırpı Dusap. Sırpı Dusap is the first Armenian woman novelist who in the 1880s wrote 3 novels promoting women's emancipation from societal norms and moral double standards. Dusap was an activist of girls' education as well, and she chaired the Protaser Dignaz Îngerutyun, an association which was founded to train Armenian girls as teachers to work in provincial schools. Zabel Asadur Sibil, with her pen name, was a prolific poet, novelist, short story writer, playwright, textbook writer, public speaker, and educator. She was also an activist of girls' education and founded and chaired Askanover Hayukyats Îngerutyun in 1879. And this association opened girls' schools, Armenian girls' schools, all over the Ottoman Empire in provinces such as Adana, Kii, and Bilecik.
Anais is the next person that we focus. She was a daring poet and short story writer. She even has poems dedicated specifically to the sexual desires of women. And something that, as you can imagine, for the early 20th century Armenian life, writing these poems, suggestive poems about specifically the female body and the female desire, while being an Armenian mother of 2 girls, was daring, but she did it. But she was a public intellectual, well-respected social worker. She chaired the Protaser Dignaz Îngerutyun for 3 decades in Istanbul and then in Paris. Zarui Kalemkerian is another fierce intellectual and feminist. She is the first person who started a women's section in one of the most popular dailies of Istanbul in the 1890s. She lived a very long life until 97, left a huge corpus of work. She moved to New York, New Jersey area and spent the second half of her life in North America, busy with all kinds of Armenian organizations. Just to give one example, she was the first woman board member of the Armenian General Benevolent Union.
Arçagui Teotik was an educator, journalist, and editor whose activism took her to Cilicia in 1909, the massacre around Cilicia. And in the report that she wrote afterwards, titled Amizba Igiligia, she documented her efforts of opening an orphanage for the surviving children, her visit to the Armenian political prisoners, and a detailed and very prolific discussion of Armenians' right to self-defense, inspired by the eyewitness accounts of the Chork Marzivan dirty old resistance. Another Armenian woman who wrote about self-defense, war, and peace was Mari Valerian. Mari was a participant of the Hınçak demonstration in Kumkapı as a very young girl, and she reported it for the Hınçak newspaper. In the coming years, she would be one of the main organizers of Hınçak protests in the Ottoman capital. Because of her political activities, she had to flee to Egypt, where she published another Armenian women's journal titled Artemis. In 1915, Mari Valerian was the principal of a girls' school in Yevdokya, Tokat. From this Armenian girls' school, she was deported with her students and her colleagues during the genocide, and she died under unknown circumstances. Zabel Yesayan, probably one of the most prominent Armenian writers and women who made it into the canons of the Armenian literature. But this doesn't mean that we know everything about Zabel Yesayan. As an Ottoman Armenian internationalist intellectual, we have a very long way to go. Yesayan survived the purges, Itadis purges of 1915, but fell victim to the Stalinist purges. In the next talk by Judy Saryan and Jennifer Manukyan, we will hear more about Zabel Yesayan.
Zarui Bahri. She was a Bolshoi intellectual who, like many of her counterparts at the time, escaped from Istanbul in 1922 in fear of incoming and vengeful Kemalist forces. This is because during the years immediately preceding that year, she had operated shelters and orphanages for the previously kidnapped Armenian women and children. After she moved to Paris in the 1940s, as a grandmother taking care of her grandchildren, she wrote 5 historical novels. To this day, except for one, no Armenian anthology devoted to the history of Armenian literature devote her even a single entry. Heigen Mark. She was the editor of Heigen, Armenian Woman, in Istanbul from 1919 to 1933. Heigen is the only Armenian periodical that continued uninterrupted publication from the immediate post-genocide years until the high Kemalist era of 1930s. Heigen pursued an unapologetically and explicitly feminist agenda, pushing for women's political rights to be represented, such as in the governing bodies of the community, in the community's decision-making processes for the future. Vartui Tart Nalbandian. She was a political activist close to the Tashnak Tutun circles. During the genocide, for 2 years, she was jailed in the central prison of Constantinople's women's section because of the letters that she penned from Lausanne when she was a university student there in the immediately preceding years to her parents in Istanbul. These letters were considered Armenian nationalist propaganda, and they were jailed. When she comes out, she relocates to the United States. She marries another ARF sympathizer, partisan at one point, Avant Nalbandian. Together, they formed this husband and wife team called Avant, and published the famous historical treatise titled Միացյալ եւ անգախտուրanya, ինչ կձրակրեն թուրքերը, which is most of the times attributed only to her husband. The last person that we focus is the legendary editor of Yerdasart Hayuhi, Siran Seza. She published this women's journal in Beirut from 1932 to 68, with some interruption in between. She is also a Bolshoi intellectual who, unlike others, went to the United States to receive her master's and PhD at Columbia University in journalism and literature. But when she was a PhD candidate, she decided to go to Lebanon and to start a women's journal. She is also a prolific short story writer and a novelist, and all of them revolve around female characters and their challenges on a daily basis.
As you might have noticed, we are covering an entire century. Our aim is to shed light onto how these women's biographies intersected with the important historical processes of Armenian history. If we were to remind ourselves what the major events of the time period within which these women lived in the Armenian history, we can count the Armenian intellectual awakening on the global scale, Ottoman Armenian secularization and modernization movements, constitutionalism, peasant resistances, political mobilization for the betterment of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, Hamidian massacres, 1909 Cilicia massacres, the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, the Balkan Wars, the genocide, and the subsequent minoritization and diasporization of Ottoman Armenian population, the foundation of the first independent Armenian Republic, and its Sovietization. These women's life experiences and politics were shaped within this context. They were social political actors who took part in these processes. Also, as public intellectuals, teachers, school principals, public speakers, founders and chairs of educational and charitable organizations, founders and directors of orphanages, founders and directors of shelters for women and children who were kidnapped during the genocide, as lobbyists, as propagandists, these women participated in the making of Armenian history.
But they also took up the pen to narrate those events, either at the time of their happening or in their immediate aftermath. For instance, the easiest example that comes to mind is Zabel Yesayan's Averaknerun Meç, which is an indispensable source if you, or Arshagui Teotik's Amismi Igligya, these are indispensable sources in order to have a feel of how Adana or Kilikya in general felt in the aftermath of the massacre there. Or if you want to learn about the armistice era post-genocide Istanbul, you shouldn't, as good historians, should not miss the fact that Heigen was there producing knowledge about what is happening at the time. Also, these women themselves regarded themselves as historical actors, social, political, historical actors, and they must have thought of themselves as worthy of documenting, because many of them, especially the ones who are closer in time to us, they wrote memoirs. And in their memoirs, you have some unique details about specific times and places that sometimes we don't find in the male memoirs about the same era.
From early on, feminists fought the perception that women were inferior to men because of their biological nature or because of God's will. Feminism challenges patriarchy, the ideology that produces and reproduces sexual subordination. It believes that patriarchy is a social construction, therefore can and must change. This is its revolutionary potential.
We are often asked if we can refer to all of these women as feminists, given the fact that some of them did not self-identify as feminists. Or we are asked if the term feminism can apply to that era that precedes the very coining of the term feminism. And these kind of questions reminds us when the denialists question if the term genocide can apply to Armenians, given the fact that it wasn't coined until late 1940s. These women, on the other hand, in the scholarship, this retrospective applicability of the historically inscribed term feminism have been debated for a long time, and it is resolved. Basically, anyone who is against male domination, and they all were, anyone who finds the hierarchical gender order problematic and wants to change it, and they all did, is considered a feminist regardless of time and place. Besides, important piece of information, very early on, as early as 1890s, Armenians themselves did use this term feminism in Armenian.
The women we cover in the project worked to change the society's perception of what Armenian women were and what they could be. Depending on the time period within which they wrote, they expressed their demands by using terms such as feminism, revolution, women's cause, women's just cause, progress, reform, women's liberation, or freedom. This was the vocabulary within which these women spoke feminism in Armenian.
And at any moment, Armenian women had to juggle multiple jeopardies. In the process, they improvised a feminism of their own, which is something that we committed themselves to studying. Our project will show that adding these particular women, or their thinking, their ideology, their feminist critique into the canons of Armenian history will inevitably change or should change the meta-narrative of Armenian history as we know it today. Ours is one possible story. One of our biggest goals is to inspire others to write more and more stories with protagonists that are women who, for instance, wrote in Eastern Armenian. This is a beginning, so that's why we chose the Western Armenian. Or women who were musicians. So ours is focused on writers, but they can be musicians, scientists, politicians, educators, different categories. We want to emphasize that innovation is a good thing. Being future-oriented is admirable. But as we all know it way too well as Armenians, an honest and just recognition of the past in its full dimensions matters to the future's generations and matters existentially. When we intervene into the narration of the past, that is, when we innovate a past, we don't manufacture it, we just modify it, make it better. We actually uncover the potential of the present and therefore, in fact, intervene into the future.
Despite all the attacks against them, these women that we study stood up for their causes. They were revolutionaries. And by reclaiming their struggles, we are innovating a past so that Armenian women of today can look back and find role models and get encouraged to fight injustices that they are facing today. And this is our revolution.
Thank you.
Thank you.